Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we are continuing on with my Shroud Wars series. It's been a while, so I think it's been about at least a month or a month and a half since I've done a Shroud related topic. But I'm here joined by the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. Hey there, Hugh.
Hi
Um,
there.
I'm just kind of, do you want to just, we are also supposed to be joined by Dr. Ken Stevenson. I don't know what happened with him. Maybe there's a mix up. Hopefully he'll join later on in the show and we can speak with him representing the pro Shroud side. But yeah, today we're going to be looking at the remaining miscellaneous image forming hypotheses. So things like the artistic boiling hypothesis, the bacteria hypothesis of Stephen Mattingly and also Garza-Valdes. Um, there's also a direct contact theories, involving Volkringer patterns, and I think Alan Mills came up with the Singlet-Oxygen version of that. And then finally, we're going to turn to a supernatural mechanism, a Buddhist one. Did Jesus have a rainbow body? And that accounts for the resurrection. So that's the plan for today. But Hugh, just before we get into it, I want to turn it over to you because I know that we actually, I haven't published my show yet, but hopefully sometime in March I'll do so. But you and Julio have been kind of collaborating, evaluating your image formation. And do you want to tell the audience what that's about?
Yes, why not? I wish I had my samples here. I wasn't expecting them, but yes, Julio challenged me to produce something, anything. He didn't insist on, an exact reproduction of the shroud or anything like that, but just what I want to see where your experiments have got to so far, which I thought was perfectly fair. So I sent him a couple of little squares of my own individually made shroud material. Um, Sellotaped, or what do you call it, scotch taped onto a little metal bas relief, so it was only 10 centimeters square. And then I dabbed with, as I've suggested many times, dabbed color onto them, which consisted of a mixture of egg yolk, which was what tempera used to be made of, and that was the bit that usually was used to um, glue pigment onto a sheet in the Middle Ages. A bit of yellow ochre, um, again, mineral yellow ochre, not chemically made from a reputable oil paint shop. Um, Water and vinegar. They used to put vinegar in with tempera because it lasts. And I've discovered this: if you put vinegar in, it doesn't go off. But if you do, if you don't put vinegar in, then the egg starts to pong quite quickly, and the whole paint goes a bit yucky.
There's no
So,
wine in that because I
sorry.
used to say there was wine involved or something.
There's a particular reference in something called the Use of Hereford, which is um, a book of ecclesiastical procedures, which says that in their version of the Quem Queritis ceremony, the figure of Christ that was put into the Easter sepulchre was washed with wine and water before it was put in there. And I thought if it was washed with wine and then draped um, with a cloth, that might well have ended up as the wine turned to vinegar over the next few days. Um, Actually, it would be the same as vinegar staining the cloth. But either way, vinegar was sometimes used in tempera, and you'll remember that I was going to say Gala Shelley used vinegar. I don't think he did actually. I think he used very dilute sulfuric acid. But either way, um, part of my hypothesis is that the discoloration of the fibers is due to an acidic reaction, not to a radiation reaction. Anyway, so I made these two little things and sent them off to Julio so that he could tear them apart. I mean, quite literally, he said, "I'm not going to give you them back. I want to pull out fibers and pull out this and pull out that." And he then published a paper, and well, I was cautious to say how rigorously it was vetted, since the paper was published in a scientific journal about 2 weeks after I sent him the samples. So that was pretty quick going.
Yeah, Julio
But anyway,
himself was surprised at how quickly his paper was accepted there.
yeah, well, he's got a bit of a reputation now, so they think, oh, this is going to be good. And I think if reputation does good things for you. He wasn't just completely out of the blue.
Yeah, so it's
And
go ahead.
sorry, yeah. Well, he judged my little samples that I sent him on 12 criteria, um, some of which I felt were fair, some of which I felt were, some of which he accepted and said, yes, your samples match these criteria. Um, some of which I disagreed with. I disagree with the criteria, and some of which I just found thoroughly confusing because they seem to say two different things. I could go into what they were if you like, or if you're
Well,
waiting. But otherwise,
yeah,
that's what we're working towards.
absolutely. Yeah. And just so the fans know, so I've been sitting on this for a while. So I am just waiting for Hugh to complete a blog, and then Julio's going to do a final response. And I'm going to be presenting on the show both sides, because this is, to my mind, this is the first time a skeptic and a pro shroud scientist have worked together on an image forming experiment and collaborate.
Or indeed work together on anything. To be perfectly honest, I mean, since the days when Walter Macron was well, there was a mutual separation and a falling out of egos. But apart from that, Joe Nickel did his bit, but he didn't discuss it with anybody. He just published this is how it was done, and that other
He
people said
refused.
oh, it wasn't, and that was that.
Yeah, because
But actually, in terms of a back and forth collaboration, that's new. Yeah.
yeah, because I think with Joe Nickel, one of the criticisms I heard, like Stirp wanted him to send us your samples, right? Because he refused to do that, so Stirp had to create their own, recreate the method and create their own things, and then Joe Nickel will come back. Oh well, you cheated. You didn't get the best results like I
Yeah.
did. But the best part about this is when we're working together. Look, we Giulio Fonte was using your samples. You did the
Yeah.
experiment and sent it to him. So I think that's a major step for
Yeah.
progress. I'm happy
I
with
think
it.
Gala Shelley, after doing his one, he cooperated with Tybalt Heimburger for a while,
That's
and
right.
they exchanged views and so on.
I
And I think there's a thing on shroud.com by Tybalt.
there it's yeah. Okay, so I don't feel as special then. I stand corrected, but
Oh no! This is I mean, this is the first time that, yeah, true, true. I know. I think it's groundbreaking.
awesome, awesome. All right, cool. So look out for a show as soon as Hugh gets up the blog sometime in March, and Julio gives me his final response. That show, I will do that show and post up the paper and all the details for you guys, the blog and all that. Okay, but for today, let's focus on the image formation theories that we're focusing on here. And the first one, this miscellaneous image forming one, is actually one of the oldest. Next to the traditional painting hypothesis, this is the second oldest artistic image formation theory out there, and it's called the boiling hypothesis. So, believe it or not, this type of theory was introduced back in 1503. So, well before Stirp, well before the photonegative images. In 1898, a French aristocrat named Antoine de Lalaing came up with this, and he said that quote unquote the shroud was quote unquote boiled in oil, tried by fire, and steamed many times without either effacing or altering the said imprint and figure. So right there, he's describing the appearance of the shroud in his day, which proves that yeah, there wasn't paint still on this thing in even just a couple hundred years afterwards. The images looked like they do today, kind of thing. But it's on this basis of this quote that some skeptics, including Hugh in his own theory, but they'll say that okay, well, the shroud was washed in water or perhaps oil, but the new thing here is that it was boiled in oil or water to produce a chemical reaction resulting in the shroud's images. And this is an artistic theory kind of thing. So, yeah, I guess Hugh, I'll turn it over to you. Just number one, have I described the boiling hypothesis properly? And what's your take on the boiling hypothesis? You're muted.
Sorry, I was coughing, so I muted myself. It's not really an image creation hypothesis. It's more, shall we say, an image stabilization or evidence that the image is stabilized. Now, it's quite the evidence in. I was trying to find the date. Did you say it was 15 something?
1503.
Yeah. Now, by 1503, the shroud had been sculling around for 200 years, and it had gained quite a lot of bits and pieces. And some of the things that it's gained are, for example, blobs of wax, which are still found on it right now. So, had it been boiled in oil, any sort of oily detritus which would have been there at the time would have been either smeared out into almost invisibility or simply destroyed altogether, dissolved in the boiling oil. So I'm a bit suspicious about boiling a shroud in boiling oil. I'm not sure it happened at all, and I don't know why this particular monk should say that it had, unless there was a tradition, and perhaps a quite local tradition, of testing things. For a long time, people used to think that the poker holes, before they saw very good pictures of it, were places where the shroud had been stabbed with a red hot poker. Well, we don't think that now. For a start, their holes look much too irregular. They don't go all the way through. It doesn't look as though it's been actually pierced. And most peculiar of all, we'd like to know, did the shroud pass or fail? If you say, right, if the test is to be stabbed with a poker, then it should do something different from what ordinary cloths do. Well, the poker holes are clearly holes. It didn't repel the poker, so presumably it failed the test. But that's slightly beside the point. The thing is that if you could test something by, let's see if the image is still there if we boil the shroud in oil. But that's got to be weird, hasn't it? I mean, why would you want to test whether the image was still there? If you firmly believed that it was, as indeed most people did in the 16th century, it had become accepted as a genuine relic. The last thing you'd want to do is to put your Lord to the test. And I don't think anybody, there was no question of it being medieval in origin, so there was no need to test it. So I think he's referring to just a sort of more generic kind of idea that it could have survived boiling in oil, but I really don't believe anybody actually did.
Okay, and
I think that's probably true of most authenticists. Now, I don't know what it's like if you boil any linen in oil, but I imagine it comes out like like literally what we would call oilcloth.
Mhm.
It's a kind of waterproof, fairly stiff waterproof cloth that you use for making waterproof coats out of, or they used to make waterproof coats out of it. They're very stiff and very rigid. And the shroud isn't like that. It's soft and supple and doesn't show any traces of having been boiled in oil at all. So that's the best I can do with that, really.
Now there is another version a skeptic might say and say, okay, well, maybe it wasn't boiled in oil, but it was boiled in water. Do you think that performs any better, or are there problems with even supposing that, in your view?
I think it was almost certainly washed. I think it may have been washed several times. I think it was certainly washed after the fire. At some point, when I had nothing better to do, I folded up a sheet into the requisite number of layers and got one of our Britain's leading blacksmiths to drop a block of iron onto it Alas, it wasn't silver. I couldn't persuade him to melt some silver for me, which was, I thought, thoroughly unreasonable on his part. But turns out that if you drop molten silver on cloth, it tends to get a bit contaminated, and it's difficult then to make beautiful jewelry out of. Anyway, but he did heat up a block of iron um, until it was 1,000 degrees, and then dropped it onto this sheet that I'd folded up, and it made a most appalling mess. I mean, it went through. I think I published it on one of the British Society of Turin Shroud newsletter articles. It went through and it produces the pattern, rather like the pattern that we see. But the amount of charred bits and pieces that ended up spread all over the cloth made it look very messy indeed. And in order for it to look at all nice, yeah, I washed it, and then it looked a lot better. So I
Now,
think it was probably washed. Yeah.
now, when you're speaking about washing, though, you're talking about cold water, whereas this is boiling water. Does that
Well,
make
I'm
a
not
big difference?
necessarily warm water, possibly, but again, what would be the point of boiling it? I don't see.
Talk
Yeah,
skeptic.
it may be that um, Julio may have taken my sample and boiled it because he thinks it's a fake, and he was hoping that if he boils it, he might remove not only all the pigment but also any residual stain underneath.
Mhm.
But there was nobody. I mean, there were lots of people who believed in the authenticity as much as Julio, but there was nobody who felt there was any need to test it at the time. Um, no, I mean, I think people used to do washing, and they washed everything in boiling water because there was a way of disinfecting it apart from anything else. Um, but washing a sheet like that size, you need a pretty big cauldron and an awful lot of um, fire and stuff, and you then have to sort of drape it out. You see, this is, it seems to me, you then have to have a very long table,
Yeah.
um,
It's
and then drape
implausible.
it out and scrub all the bits off. You see, I think it was scrubbed. One of the samples that I sent to Julia was as I produced it, and then the other half I scrubbed with a toothbrush
Mhm.
fairly thoroughly to try and remove as much of the paint as I possibly could.
So,
Um,
so you would argue it's historic, this boiling water or boiling oil thing, it's historically implausible. It just doesn't make
I
sense.
think the boiling oil is totally historically implausible. Boiling water, I think it's possible. I don't think it's necessary in order to keep. It could only have been done to make the cloth cleaner and get rid of all the charred bits, rather than to
So what
test
I,
its permanence. I think.
but I thought you were saying like because of the size of it, it would be historically implausible. Like how would they get such a big cauldron
But
and
I mean, they did have state laundries. They had large bits of cloth which they did use,
okay.
but um, so it could have been done in a cathedral or something like that. I mean, they took all the monks' habits, for example, and they bung them all in a massive, great um, steel cauldron, basically, and pound them up and down with their beaters to get all the dirt off with whatever homemade soap they'd made. But the thing is, if you suspected that the shroud, if you were sure that the shroud was genuine, you wouldn't make it undergo a process where you hoped to remove it completely to test it, would you? I mean, that would be really silly. Um,
Okay. Well, let's do it.
Someone might say, well, it was genuine, but you've cleared out the image completely, and now we haven't got one. And you haven't proved that it was a fake. You've just washed the image away.
Fair enough. So
It would be a
yes,
terrible thing
let's
to
let's do
do.
it quick, right? Because obviously this hypothesis isn't taken seriously by anyone today, right? It was made
I
back.
don't think so.
It was done before Stirp, before Secondo Pia took his photos. So
Yeah.
let's do a quick rundown of the minimal relevant features to see how we assess it. So I'll just share my screen quickly. Is that popping up? Oh, okay.
I've got started, and then I've got double click to. Oh, there we go.
So the boiling hypothesis. Let's see if I can
What up?
you out of the way. So in the first place, I found that the boiling hypothesis can't account for the negativity. This is the only are a mechanism that doesn't account for this feature. Even the traditional painting, I gave a questionable status to that.
Oh yeah, no, Julio gave mine a tick. He said, "Yeah, that's fine."
But this isn't your. I'm talking about for the boiled oil or
Yeah, yeah,
boiled.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, even the arch, literally sent him a painting on some cloth, and he went for the. He thought that was all right. Now, I don't know quite what you mean by the boiling oil accounting for or not accounting for the negative effect. We don't think that it was a positive, and boiling it could have turned it into a negative, as it were, um, or anything like that, unless there are some interesting pictures um, of some frescoes, aren't there, which have been painted in one color, and they've reversed their color because of chemical reaction with the air. Um, but no, in principle, I don't think boiling a cloth would reverse its polarity. Well, its color intensity at all. It doesn't make any sense. So no, I agree with that.
No, I think this is a mistake. I gave it a green check mark. So I think because obviously the boiled in oil, boiled water hypothesis is meant to account for the image diffuseness aspect. I'm assuming that it would account for that, right? Like there
It
wouldn't be.
would spread, yeah. If the image had been very clear and precise, boiling it in anything could certainly smudge it out a bit, make it much more diffuse. So I'd agree with that.
But the high resolution, this should be a red X because I don't think you would have a an image as resolved as the Shroud is, right? So
I don't know that I mean, if it was fixed in place and boiling didn't change it, it wouldn't alter the resolution. It certainly wouldn't make it any higher, and it could only make it less high. But on the other hand, most of the Shroud has got very poor resolution. As I say, you try and get 10 people to decide where the edge of the legs are, and they could be 5 centimeters, well, say 2 centimeters either way. I mean, its resolution of the legs is extremely poor. It's more like 5 centimeters than 5 millimeters.
okay,
So,
now
and if you boiled a blurred shroud, I mean, the shroud in something, and it blurred the image out, it might do that. But it wouldn't. It would have done the same to the face, and the face is a much better resolution than the legs.
okay, now what about body image uniformity? So the uniformity in terms of the intensity of color. I know you deny that as a fact, but uh,
I don't think it would change it.
apart
Would
from
it?
that debate, would it account for that? Also, the density uniformity, so the max on the darkness on the front and the back side are uniform.
Well,
Um,
again, these aren't really image. The boiling water here is it's not an image making hypothesis. So if the image was uniform to start with, then I don't think that boiling it in oil would have made any difference to it. If
is
it wasn't uniform to start with, then the boiling it in oil might have made it more uniform.
no, wouldn't the but like that would cause the background cloth to be as well because it's in the oil as well being boiled
Oh
and
yeah, yeah, yeah. It would discolor everything,
like
but
could
then
it
it might increase the uniformity. It would tend to disperse whatever was there.
yeah you
Whatever
wouldn't even
whatever
be
kind of gradient you like, whether it's an intensity gradient or a pigment gradient or a stain gradient or an edge gradient or a resolution gradient, boiling a thing in oil is likely to smear all that out and make it much vaguer than it was before.
gotcha.
Um, I would think, but it certainly wouldn't make it any better.
Yeah. And I think the three dimensionality and stuff like that, regardless of the artistic technique, we've kind of disputed that last time in part 16 that, artistic methods don't reproduce the three dimensionality. But even if they did, I think that would be totally messed up if it was then boiled in oil and boiled in water. That would get rid of the three dimensionality effect.
But
And
well, no, if it didn't move, if it didn't alter the the stains on the thread on the fibers, it wouldn't have any effect on the three dimensionality. Why would it? Why would it? Why would it move the um, image away, as it were? Even if supposing it, let's take a radiation hypothesis and say that the fibers that were dark because of radiation, and they are next to fibers which are light because they have missed the radiation. I don't see that boiling it in anything would have any effect.
I
You see what I
guess if
mean?
it's I guess if it's because in your case you're supposing it's kind of like oxidize the acid oxidize the cellulose. So like boiling it in
Yeah.
water won't have any effect on that, but
No, no.
it
And if it's
would if it
radiated, well, however the image has been put on the cloth, unless it is only a superficial pigment, I don't see that the oil will make any difference. Or water.
right.
Obviously, if it's just
And
a
this
superficial pigment, then the water certainly might wash it away.
yeah, and obviously that's what Antoine Delalande his hypothesis is assuming that it was painted kind of thing, right? So the image is due to paint. So okay, so that would mess that up. Vertically mapped wrapping distortions, that would be the same. It's an X on that. Um Now superficiality. Okay, so if it was due to some kind of pigment and stuff like that, and then you boiled it in oil or boiled it in water, wouldn't that affect superficiality in some way or no?
It might make the if it was a thin paint particles in a medium, they might go further in, I suppose. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, they might
that's what
do.
I was. So red X there. Also, there would be evidence of cementation and stuff like that, obviously, and capillary flow because it's flowing through in the non-saturation. I didn't address that one. I left it as purple. Do you think that boiling the images in oil would cause the images to be more saturated in some way?
No, quite the reverse. I would expect them to be less saturated, if anything.
Gotcha. So would that be inconsistent with the? I think Giulio Fontes calculated the saturation image of the shroud at the darkest point. The face is 23% plus or minus 5%. So would we expect this hypothesis to be inconsistent with the shrouds?
23%, 23% of what?
It's
What?
23% as dark as it could be.
I see. What would 100% look like?
I don't know, totally dark, I guess. Like totally,
Black.
it's as dark as it.
Absolutely black.
Yeah, yeah, it's as dark as it can possibly be.
Right. So it's 1/4 as dark as black. Fair enough.
Yeah. So obviously that's something you need to replicate and stuff. And this would be probably far less than that, but I guess we don't know. Okay. Anatomical accuracies, I'll skip over that. Okay, the blood stains, my gosh. Obviously the blood stains, even under your theory, that aren't due to oxidized cellulose. So it's due to pigment. So wouldn't this would definitely alter the blood stains and
I think the blood stains would go completely.
yeah.
If they were boiled in oil, surely there'd be even less of them than there are now. Um, I suspect that if it was boiled in water, that would have removed most of the blood stains as well. Um, as it is, the blood stains, if you look at them, um, I think they would survive being sponged down, which is what I think happened to try and get rid of the fire damage. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, I think, as I say, I think they could have been sponged away without without disappearing. But I think boiling them in anything, we'd have even less blood stain than we have now.
Absolutely. And obviously the next one, so this wouldn't apply to the boiling in water hypothesis, but with the boiled in oil hypothesis, look, they Stirp studied it. There are no spices, no evidence for oil, no evidence for biochemicals, and I think this is the thing you mentioned, right? Like even the texture of the cloth, it would become what did you call it? An oil
Yes.
coat or something? I know.
It was called an oil skin or an oilcloth. It was called oilcloth.
Oil cloth. Okay. So yeah, it's look, we would detect this and Stirp didn't find it. So this automatically falsifies this.
No, I don't think so. I think, of course, a lot depends on what oil you're talking about. When you say Stirp didn't find any oil, well, they weren't really looking for it, and it's difficult. It's a fairly organic solvent. It consists of hydrogen and carbon and maybe a bit of oxygen, and that's what the shroud's made of. So, you can't. Not easy to tell the difference, really.
If it was boiled in oil, though, it would be readily apparent. Like that's what you've kind of already
I
said.
think it would. I think it would. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you just Google oilcloth, you'll find that it's very different from just ordinary linen.
All right, perfect. All right, cool. So, yeah, overall, I think that the boiling hypothesis is just an utter failure. It does not account for the minimal relevant features, and both Hugh and I are agreeing on that. So we're together as
Yeah,
pro Shroud and Shroud
yeah,
skeptic,
that's right.
and I'm sure Ken would, if he were here, he would give us a thumbs up. So, all right, so
Oh, I hope so. Yes.
absolutely. So let's move on then to the next hypothesis, and this is a naturalistic one involving a body. So I call it the bacteria hypothesis or the fungal hypothesis.
Right.
And
Yes. Now, I did write a bit about this. I'm just going to go and see if I can find another charger because I've got one charger charging this computer, but I need another charger to charge the other computer, which has just died on me. So,
no problem. I'll just introduce what the theory is for people as you do that.
go
Um,
ahead.
yeah, so there have been there have been a couple of Shroud skeptics who've tried to offer this theory. So one of them is a guy named Stephen Mattingly, and another is Dr. Leoncio Garza-Valdes, who, interestingly, he came up in the carbon 14 discussion because he was the one who postulated the bacteria producing this bioplastic coating, which threw off the carbon 14 dates. And unfortunately, his theory has been totally falsified because if that were true, again, the shroud, it would be so obvious. The shroud would be coated in this bioplastic bacteria coating and it would be brittle and would fall apart and we would be able to see it. It would not be a flexible t-shirt like cloth. So anyways, but he also supposes that the bacteria or this fungus produces the body images on the Shroud of Turin. And the bloodstains are encoded through direct contact, which we've covered wouldn't work. But yeah, he basically says there was invisible to the naked eye, but a clear encasing or bioplastic coating composed of millions of microbiological organisms or bacteria, and these formed the images over time, similar to the formation of a coral reef. And like I said, Stephen Mattingly also has a very similar hypothesis of his own that was covered, where he basically says biological materials and proteins, and they contain elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And these, over time, produced the body images on the shroud as we see them. And that was, yeah. So that's what this theory is. So, Hugh, I'll turn it over to you. And first of all, what is your take? Did I describe what the bacterial slash fungal hypothesis is?
More or less, the hypothesis as published by, first of all, Leoncio Garza-Valdes. I don't know whether he's just American, but with that name, or whether he is generally Hispanic. I think he's just an ordinary American, as it were, a pediatrician, if I'm not mistaken, something like that, with an amateur interest in Mexican archaeology. And on that basis, he published a book called The DNA of God, which obtained for him, I would say, fairly brief notoriety, which appeared like a flash in the pan. Anybody publishing a book announcing he'd found the DNA of God is a bit remarkable, and then vanished without trace. And the main reason it vanished without trace was based on his idea that every fiber of the shroud was covered in what he called a bioplastic coating. And he claimed that during his investigation of two specific Middle American relics, that he'd found these things on bits of Mayan jade. Yeah, I think one, they were called a tun. I think I'm trying to think whether one was a sort of gorget neck piece or something like that. But anyway, they were bits of jade carving, which he announced had got a bioplastic coating on them, and this had either preserved them or damaged them or made them appear older or younger or whatever it was. The thing is that he is the only person who's ever found this on anything. There is something, perhaps it's called rock varnish, is its normal name, and it's well known, and it appears particularly things which have been outside for a long time and weathered in the rock. And a lot of archaeological remains are covered with this rock varnish, but it's not biological. And the idea that it's bioplastic has gained absolutely no credence whatever. It has achieved no archaeological, and it's been some time since he published the book, but it's achieved no archaeological recognition. And so I'm inclined to believe that it's simply not there at all. He made it up. What's more, when he published some photographs of shroud fibers with thick edges saying, look, here is the bioplastic varnish. Well, for a start, it didn't look much like a bioplastic varnish. And for a second, everyone said that either it was just the PCB or it was the, according to Rogers, of course, it was the coating that each shroud had of saponaria or something like that, or starch coating when it was made. So he made absolutely no headway in with either authenticists, with shroud skeptics, or even his fellow archaeologists. It's a hypothesis that ended up dead in the water. Anyway, that's the bioplastic varnish hypothesis.
Now I'm curious because
that's really more to do with the age of the shroud than the actual image making. Now we come on to Stephen Mattingly, who was a sort of generated from that. And Stephen Mattingly really should know better, to be perfectly honest. His paper is I would like to say it's loud. When you read it, it's loud. It says, it mentions several times how stupid everybody else is apart from himself.
Of course.
He then announces that we contain huge amounts of bacteria, as indeed our skin does. It is covered in bacteria, and our gut is full of bacteria. In fact, some sources, and I dare say they're right, say that we have either more or at least the same number of bacterial cells as we do our own cells, our cells with our DNA in. He announces quite boldly that human beings are more than half bacteria. But that's absurd. It's utterly ridiculous. And the reason it's utterly ridiculous, and he knows it's utterly ridiculous, is that bacteria are tiny. All the bacteria in an entire human body, including its gut and its skin and all the other places, you could fit into a spoon. And so we're not more than half bacteria. In order to try and demonstrate that a tortured, sweaty body, the bacteria on the skin would be growing like mad, and he decided he would do a sort of experiment that would do that, and he produced his hand and he coated it in a sort of porridge which was millimeters thick, and said, look, I can make an image on a cloth. Yeah. And you go, well, yes, I expect anybody could. But the idea that a dead body was covered in a millimeter thick of bacteria is preposterous. And so this was another hypothesis which got absolutely nowhere.
So it's totally implausible, empirically implausible to a supposed body.
If I could just go back to the other thing, was that the idea that the bacteria living on a body could change the radiocarbon date, because that's part of both hypotheses, the Leoncio Garza-Valdes and Stephen Mattingly. I think both go for this. But again, I don't know about Garza-Valdes because, as I say, he was an amateur, he was dabbling, he was doing his best, and in fact, he published two papers which were really quite sound on Mexican artifacts. But as I say, Mattingly is a microbiologist and ought to know better. But if you've got, supposing I had a piece of wood, which is dates from any date you like, say 300 AD. Well, if it's covered in bacteria and they eat the wood, so there's nothing left except the bacteria, and I date the bacteria, well, they'll come to the same date because they're made of the same stuff.
Yeah.
Bacteria won't change the carbon content of themselves if they're just the same thing. It's just like if you get a piece of wood and you chop it into sawdust, it's not going to make it have more carbon-14 or less carbon-14. The only way you would get more carbon-14 in is if the bacteria, and there are such things, lots of them, are photosynthetic. And they acquire their carbon dioxide from the air during the time when they're exposed to the air. But the shroud is hardly ever exposed to the air. There's been absolutely zero possibility for photosynthetic bacteria to fix any atmospheric carbon onto the shroud. So I think the whole bacteria thing is dead in the water.
Human body, that's not photosynthetic bacteria, right? We're not plants. So,
well, even if it was, it wouldn't do anything because it's dark.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so
three-toed sloths, for example, are genuinely green because they are covered in photosynthetic bacteria. You know, those things that hang by their toes from Amazonian jungles. They are photosynthetic, but not things which are buried in caves aren't.
Gotcha. And I totally agree just on my end. In terms of plausibility, look, even if we somehow come over these empirical implausibilities that Hugh's just mentioned, let's pretend somehow this did happen with this body. Again, that wouldn't happen. But then imagining that the bacteria themselves, the way they act contradicts everything we know about how bacteria and microorganisms behave and grow. Based on decades of detailed scientific studies. Imagine bacteria producing highly resolved, anatomically correct images and growing in a way, what's to stop them from growing, outside in a different pathway that's not consistent with the human body or something like that, and encapsulating three-dimensional photonegative images that are strictly vertically mapped. That's just that's impossible. Sorry to say. And I think, as Hugh said, yeah, one textile specialist, John Tyre, mentioned that flax, when bleached, as is the case with the shroud, has a high resistance to bacteriological attack, so long as it's kept dry. So, let alone, this bacterial colony couldn't even flourish on the shroud, just because it's not, the textile itself isn't conducive to that. And I think Hugh made this point. Oh, yeah. The other plausibility point is, even if the bacteria, we suppose everything is consistent with what the shroud skeptics want, again, that would cause the shroud to be so brittle that it would literally shatter if it was dropped today. But the shroud is flexible. So those are the points I have on plausibility. Do you have anything to say on that before we go to the MRFs? Hugh?
Not further to what I've said before. I've got my own. It's on medievalshroud.com if anybody's interested. You can find my thing on this subject. It's a review of a book called The Jesus Microbiome, an Instagram from the First Century.
That's the name of the blog.
Which is Stephen J. Mattingly's book. And I say much the same as I've said here.
What's the name of your blog? Because you don't have a search function, so it's hard. You have to Google it directly.
Oh yeah, Medieval Shroud, all one word. .com.
But what's the name of the specific blog?
The particular, it's called The New Microbiome.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, so in order to try and make people read more bits, I try and make the headings to each particular post give no clue to what's inside them. But
And
this,
that's the thing I hate about your blog because there's no like search function on it. It's like it's
well,
hard to
well,
find like, okay, if I want to look.
there's a little magnifying glass on the top right hand corner, I think, but I have to search through it myself sometimes. If I go, oh, I'm trying to remember, what did I say about, I don't know, Gary Habermas or something like that. Then
Yeah.
I have to search it because I can't remember where I put it.
All right.
Um, but yes, and I'm sorry to say that the more people say how confusing it is, the better I like it.
Very well, very well. You've succeeded. But all right, so in terms of the MRFs, oh my goodness, look, this bacterial hypothesis is, I think it's actually the worst. It's pure X's right the way down. So it would not produce photonegative images.
I,
The
I
bac
don't see how it could. You'd have to, if you imagine that you put a cloth over a person and that somehow the thing is that bacteria don't jump from place to place. So every bit has to be contact. So you're relying entirely on the amount of bacteria per surface area making contact with the cloth. And that means that you're rather assuming that, say, the eye sockets had fewer bacteria per surface area than the tip of the nose or something like that, so that you could make contact with both of them. They'd both make an image, but the eye sockets would be darker than the tip of the nose. And that just doesn't seem to me credible. I mean, if anything, crevices tend to fill up with more bacteria, and the tip of the nose, you'd have thought only a quick wipe and you'd get most of it off. So, no, you're quite right. Photo negativity, not a chance.
Gotcha. Obviously, high resolution body images and image diffuseness is no, because the
Well,
bacteria
no,
would.
it's absolutely a contact image, and there's no way of, I mean, either the bacteria do their stuff or they don't. It's a bit of an on-off that. Yeah.
Okay. Body image uniformity. Would they create images that have uniform intensity of color? Again, I know you deny that as a fact, but assuming it is, it would fail to account for that. Maximum density
Oh.
uniformity, it wouldn't do that. Why would bacteria, how could they possibly communicate and coordinate to make sure they're making the darknesses uniform? Do you agree on that? Uniformity, total failure?
I don't think it works at all. No.
Okay. And just to go faster, three dimensionality, no. Vertically mapped wrapping distortions, no. Also, you'd have to ask, why is there no body sides or top of the head? Like, why the bacteria on the sides of the thing don't?
Well, again, yes, if it was anywhere where the cloth touched the body would do whatever it is that it does, and it didn't.
Gotcha. And how would it encode non-contact zones as well? Like, even if you have a cloth tightly wrapped around, there's going to be areas where it's not touching, like the side of the nose and stuff like that. So no
Yeah,
contact.
areas where it's not touching would not produce any image at all because yes, bacteria
Fair
don't
enough.
jump.
Yeah, you're repeating. And what about superficiality? How would the bacteria hypothesis do on that front? Wouldn't the bacteria grow vertically as well as horizontally or something? They wouldn't.
No, and they're very small. Um, but linen's very tough to get through. So I mean, it's just possible that they might contaminate only the upper surface and not work their way into the thread. If you get a piece of moldy cloth, you can brush the mold off quite well, and it doesn't necessarily send its little hypothelia deep into the threads.
Okay. I think it
So
would.
I think a lot of these things are dependent one upon the other, and if they don't work to start with, they're not going to work after a while either.
And there would be a question: would it be as superficial as the shroud is, like zero point 0.2
I'd
nanometer? And
I'd be inclined to say no.
gotcha.
Basically, the bacteria, if they attacked the cloth, they'd eat the fibers. So the fibers would look like a cartoon version of an apple core. They
Yeah,
would go, they'd chomp their way right through.
absolutely. Yep. Okay. No, in terms of the blood stains, obviously they're supposing the blood stains got on through direct contact. So I gave that a red X because when we evaluated direct contact, I don't think that can naturally explain the blood stains and stuff. I think when we covered direct contact, did you agree that that can't explain the blood stains, or do you think that it could explain the blood stains? I forget.
No, I don't think it could possibly explain the blood stains. I mean, what we're imagining, if you take something like a hand with a wound on it, if the whole thing is thick with bacteria, what on earth, you're not going to get those nice, well-defined blood stains. It's just going to be a sort of oozy mess. Again, it looks as though someone's poured a bucket of soup over the wrist or something
That's
like
a
that.
That's a great point. Yeah, because if the body was encoded with this amount of bacteria, this implausible amount, that would impact on the blood stains and
If the
affect.
blood was dried on, then the bacteria covering would cover it. And if it was still liquid, as it oozed through, it would just sort of go through and diffuse amongst the mess. So I don't think that's very sensible.
Awesome. And the last point I have here is on, oh yeah, there are no spices, oils, or biochemicals associated with a body in life or death. So under biochemical, bacteria would show up under those studies, right?
You'd certainly think so. One of the things is, I'm just trying to find, there's a little bit here. Um, if it be supposed, this is me, that almost two-thirds of it, of the shroud, has been converted to biome, then the integrity of the remaining original fabric would be so compromised as to make it far too fragile to handle. So Mattingly says that the shroud is now sealed in a coating of fungal hyphae and bacterial polybeta hydroxyalkanate, which he says is widely used in Europe as biodegradable plastic. And I go, well, yes, quite. It's biodegradable. So the bacteria would eat it. It couldn't be sealed. You wouldn't seal your bacteria in by covering the shroud with bacteria food. If I
Uh,
made you a jail out of bananas and chocolate, however strong it was to start with, it wouldn't take you long to chew your way through it.
exactly. Let's
I'm very fond of bananas and chocolate, but whatever your favorite food is.
Awesome. There we go. Sorry, I was trying to look something up there. So, all right,
Yeah,
cool. I think once again we're in total agreement. Shroud skeptic,
yeah.
me as a pro Shroud authenticist. This just utterly fails. This is not a good image forming theory. So,
No.
all right. Well, so let's move on to there's actually two here, but they're very similar. So I include them as the same thing. So it's kind of related. It's like a nuanced version of a gas diffusion and a direct contact theory. But so we have the Volkringer method,
Yeah.
proposed by John DeSalvo, and also so he proposed this in 1982, from my understanding. And there's also Alan Mills' the Singlet-Oxygen hypothesis, which
Oh,
utilizes Volkringer patterns and stuff like that. But yeah, so basically the Volkringer hypothesis states that Volkringer patterns. So when you put like a plant in a book and then you press it, it'll create these brown patterns of the leaf, and these are called Volkringer patterns.
yeah.
And this was adopted by their high resolution, very detailed photo negative images that are produced. And in order to get these images, it does take decades to even centuries to produce these images. So that could be a problem there. Um, but this was adopted by John DeSalvo in 1982 in a theory which combines various elements of a direct contact, lactic acid gas diffusion theory, and then these Volkringer patterns or method to produce these shroud images. This theory, it was called the revised vapographic hypothesis. So Hugh, let me just ask, do you want to cover the Singlet-Oxygen theory and the Volkringer separately, or do you want to do them together?
Yes, because I think the singlet oxygen theory is chemical mumbo jumbo, whereas the Volkringer pattern has the advantage of having photographs that everyone can look at.
Okay, so do you want to do them separately then? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think that would
Okay.
be a good idea. We've got time.
Okay, so yeah, I'll turn it to you then. So have I described the Volkringer pattern hypothesis properly, and what is your take on it in explaining the
Well,
shortages?
I think it's quite an interesting hypothesis. Basically, as you suggested, anybody who gets an old Victorian book of pressed flowers, and there are lots of old Victorian books of pressed flowers around in the UK, and I dare say there's lots around in the across the pond as well. And you get hold of this thing, and it works particularly well with ferns, but it works also quite well with other flowers. And that is whether you open the book, the flowers may still be there, but if you remove the flowers, you're left with an interesting pattern, which looks, in fact, like what we primary school teachers used to call a spore print, a mushroom spore print. Yep, there we go. And as a print, it has an fantastically good resolution because the original plant's more or less 3D and the paper is pressed closely to it. And it, as you can see, it has excellent negativity. And if you've ever got it into 3D, it has very good 3D. Now, I'd like to know a lot more about how these things were formed. The one you can see there is obviously a leaf, so it's not a spore print. It's not spores. We haven't got. There was a fern. I think I saw a fern there somewhere dotted about, which could be a spore print because ferns have got spores. That's not a fern. There, they're there. A Shroud Spectrum International, and there's a picture of a fern right underneath your green picture. There's a little black pick. Look at that. There is the fern, and there it is. It's in some book or other. It looks as though it's in a plant book, and someone's put a fern, which presumably corresponds to one of the topics in the book. And as they've peeled it back, the fern has left a copy of itself there. Now that might be a spore print because ferns reproduce by spores, or it might be a leaf print or even a flower print. As I say, Victorian flower books are full of these things. Now the thing is, it's possible that someone has done some work on it, but the mysterious Mr. Volkringer, I've no idea who he is or what he did or anything. He only ever appears in context with the shroud. It's not as if he was, well, perhaps he was a separate biologist, but if so, I don't think he ever published anything. It's extremely difficult to track him down because of the something like 5 or 6 different possible ways of spelling Volkringer. So you have to try them all to see if you can find some kind of pattern for him. And I have to say, I've not been successful.
I don't know if it's true because you said there's multiple ones, but what I've seen is that Dr. John Volkringer was a pharmacist in Paris in 1942
Yeah,
when he discovered these. So that's what I got. Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, obviously, here we go. I've got a book. His what he wrote. Somebody wrote in 1991 a book called "The Holy Shroud: Science Confronts the Imprints," and that was by Volkringer. So if he discovered what he discovered in 1942, he waited a hell of a long time before he wrote anything about it. There's a copy of it in the National Library of Australia. There's even a copy of it on eBay. Let's have a look and see. The Holy Shroud, Science Confronts the Imprints by Jean Volkringer. It's $12 US dollars. Just quite good, but it'll cost about $40 because it's in New York. But it obviously exists, but it doesn't say anything about who this Volkringer fellow is. And his book is only with respect to the shroud. It doesn't seem to have published anything regarding these images just as academic curiosities. So I've tried to find things like, I don't know, plant prints or shadow prints or Victorian shadow prints and things like that without any success. However, plants do that. And if Jesus was a plant and flat and squashed by a piece of paper, he'd have made that. I suppose the one thing that's quite good about it is that a plant leaf and those images that you showed look very like a bas relief. They're not round,
Hmm.
like as if they were something solid. And in that sense, they match the imagery of the shroud extremely well.
Because there's not the in terms of the vertical mapping, there's not the wraparound.
There's no distortion, there's no wraparound distortion, because the whole thing is to all intents and purposes flat. So that's good.
Gotcha. All right. So the vertically mapped. Okay. So yeah. So I guess obviously it's totally implausible for the. I mean, because Jesus, what did they get a giant book and smush Jesus' body in? We would get a giant mess, right? It wouldn't. We wouldn't get a anything resembling.
Yes, I don't think it would ever be used to justify an authenticist imaging of Jesus. It could be a medieval way of doing it.
Okay, as an artistic.
Yes, an artistic way of doing it. If I mean, I'm speculating here because it's not something I've experimented with. But if you painted an image using very organic paints, which indeed you might, and so don't use iron oxide and lapis lazuli and all that sort of thing. Use rose madder or colors that you colors that you get from plants, and then so that you're to a certain extent you've actually got plant material all over your painting, and then layer cloth on top of it. I think I might have to buy Volkringer's book and see what he thinks.
So
He's
you
probably an authenticist, but it's not impossible that it could support. I think if somebody did more work on it, it could support a medieval point of view.
so you would say with these organic plant-based pigments, you would put it on a bas relief again, and then smush the cloth.
No, just paint it. Just here's a picture of Jesus painted on a piece of paper.
But then, but traditional painting with a brush, that wouldn't work to fit all the other.
No. That's not the shroud. That's a painting of Jesus. But then you lay the cloth over the top of this completely dry painting, rather like laying it over the top of a completely dry plant.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever it is in the plant that causes the effect on the paper covering it, maybe something like that in the painting would cause that effect. Now, it's not something I've tried or something that I really know how I would go about. But yes, that's the sort of thing that we might look at.
Yeah, I think you might get an image and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be three-dimensional. As you
Yes,
yourself agree, traditional.
you can see that it is. I mean, the Volkringer pattern is three-dimensional.
Right, with three-dimensional plants, but the painting itself wouldn't reproduce the three-dimensionality. You yourself agreed with that when we.
No, I see what you mean. Yes, it might have to be just a little sort of repoussé bas relief of some kind. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, in terms of the MRFs for Volkringer, um, uh, oh, uh, uniformity. Are these images aren't uniform in terms of
I
their
think they
color?
probably are. Yeah, I mean it's very, very slight. They're quite faint. Um, so I think they're probably pretty uniform and pretty very superficial.
On what basis do you think they're superficial? I have question marks for
Yeah,
that.
guesswork. I've got no idea. I don't even know. I mean, because I've got no idea what forms them. Um,
Sorry
I've
there.
got no reason to suppose that they shouldn't be superficial.
Hmm. I put question marks for that. I can see
Yeah.
why. What did I say under superficiality? Um, One of the main issues with Volkringer method is that the example of the plant being imprinted on multiple. Oh, so here, yeah. So the plant images with Volkringer methods are imprinted on multiple adjacent pages in the book. They're not superficial like it is with the shroud. So this would obviously have the same effect. If something like this was used to produce the shroud, it would penetrate right through, just as the plant images do. Um,
Well, there must be one um, when you get to the top layer where it doesn't go all the way through. Don't you think?
I don't understand. Like you're saying, there was multiple cloths, and
Well,
then
no,
would
no,
it?
no. I'm just thinking that if it's very strong, then it goes through multiple pages, but it doesn't always go through multiple pages. It depends on
That's
presumably
the
how long.
typical.
It depends how
Go,
long you leave it there for, probably.
well, it looks like, well, because it's being pressed so hard, is that it just goes automatically through multiple. It encodes images throughout various layers of the book's cellulose pages, and it causes the images to become deeply embedded into the various layers due to the tremendous amounts of pressure being applied. What's more, as John DeSalvo's version of this theory involves a decomposing corpse with large amounts of lactic sweat or lactic acid, which is the coloring agent for him, being placed under varying degrees of pressure, we would expect to see evidence of capillary action and cementation, in addition to causing image saturation to be much darker on the shroud than it actually is. Yeah.
Yes, um, I don't think a Volkringer uh, hypothesis would work starting with a dead body as a basis, but it might work starting with a painting as a basis. But
Interesting. Yeah.
as I
I
say,
I never
if I
considered the Volkringer as an artistic thing, so that's
oh,
interesting.
well, neither had I, but in a way, you've slightly inspired me to do so.
Interesting. All right. All right. Well, yeah. Well, maybe you should do some experiments, and we'll see how that goes. Another paper for Julio or something. But
I'm sure
okay.
he'll love it. Yeah,
Now
but
there was another major issue. With the Volkringer method is the color, because these things come out dark brown, not straw yellow like the Shroud of Turin.
yeah.
So I mean, right there, it's just it doesn't
But then
work.
again, I
And
think, um, in a way, he's published a book of pharmacy recipes for making medicines and things like that in 1953. Um, Assuming that was him and not his dad. Uh,
no,
yes, using the same criteria as is used often for the description of an authentic image, and that is that if you leave it there for long enough, the body corrodes and the image gets destroyed. Now, the patterns that people find in old Victorian flower books have been there for 100 years. Now, presumably, if I am a Victorian flower collecting lady and I press my flowers and I come back the next day, then there's no image. And if I come back 100 years later, then there is an image. But there must be somewhere along the line where there's a very faint image, maybe after a month or 6 weeks. And that faint image is the one.
okay.
Now, what I mean, where the artificial thing would break down is that I doubt if anybody would know that happened. It would have to be a complete serendipitous discovery that you wrapped your painting or whatever it was in this cloth and you came back and 6 months later you went, wow, look at that. The painting's left a sepia tone on the cloth which covered it without transferring any of the painting itself. But without knowing what the stuff actually is, I don't know whether that's valid or not.
Well, so John DeSalvo in his paper, he does address this color issue. And I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but he says this, I have done a quantitative color comparison between the Volkringer patterns and the shroud body image using a spectrophotometer. And he
Yeah.
says he obtained visible spectral reflectance data from both and that they're similar. Um, so I don't know. Is that true? I put a question mark based on that
Is it
quote, but I,
is this from the image formation process of the Shroud of Turin and its similarities to the Volkringer pattern,
correct.
which
Yeah,
is
he's saying
salvo?
that the spectral reflectance data is comparable. So he's trying to counter this. Well, the Volkringer patterns are dark brown, the shrouds are
Yeah.
straw yellow. Here's the table that he gives of it. So I don't know, you're a scientist. Does this make sense, or is he doing some fudging? I don't know if you've seen this. Are you looking at it or?
No, all I can see is your minimal relevant features, or is that what I meant to be looking at?
Oh shoot. Okay, hang on. Let me reshare because I was on his paper.
Oh, right. I
Uh,
don't know that I've read his
Here,
paper.
Can you see that now? You,
Ah, yes, that's straight out of one of the Stirp things. It's got, isn't it?
yeah, it's from
Where's
John.
where's the Volkinger thing?
What this is the reflectance
Yes,
data of,
that the graph that you've just shown
yeah.
is a Stirp graph. It's not, and it doesn't have the Volkinger pattern on it at all. When it says compared with the typical Volkinger pattern, oh wait a minute, the dots. There we go. Sample one, DeSalvo's dots. There they are. I can see them. I couldn't see them before.
So
Can you see that?
is he correct?
Well, his particular one is a much steeper slope.
So it wouldn't
You
be a
see,
match scientifically then, yeah.
no. It looks to me as though it would be slightly redder than the shroud brown color because the difference between the red end of the spectrum, the right hand end is the red end of the spectrum, and the left hand end is the blue end. And as it sort of those calf, finger, nose, and heel bits drifting slowly up produces this kind of yellow brown area, whereas a steep slope up towards the right is a much redder area. So maybe the Volkringer pattern is a much more reddish brown, which would be in keeping with sort of
Yeah.
a spore print or something like that.
So that's
So
another
yeah, in that case, the color of Volkringer pattern is different. I give him that.
awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, so this one is an utter failure, although Hugh has some questions about turning this into an artistic mechanism.
Oh,
And
it's
there would
set me off on a whole new direction. I have to get
oh
hold of the
goodness, what have
Salvo Volkringer's book.
I've
Yeah.
created a monster. What have I done here? But yeah,
Oh yeah.
maybe yeah, you can do some experimentation and we can follow up on the artistic Volkringer hypothesis or something. So
Yeah.
okay, so there is another theory here that's similar, called the singlet oxygen. And before I move on, is there anything else about Volkringer that you want to say before we move on?
No, as I say, it is extraordinarily difficult to find anything at all about the alleged patterns. The only thing that I would say is there may be people watching here who go, "Oh, I know what those are. They're called something patterns."
Hmm.
And if you're a shroud person, the only name that you ever associate it with them is Volkringer, and because and we can't find anything more about him. But they may actually have a different name, and other people do know more about them and have done some research into them.
Yeah, because they
But
do exist for sure.
oh yeah, yeah, the things do.
Okay, so the next hypothesis is very similar. It's called the singlet oxygen, otherwise known as the Russell effect hypothesis. So,
Right.
like,
Now, I remember commenting on this somewhere, probably in Shroud's story.
so
And we
yeah, so I'll just
decided,
give a brief. explanation, then I'll go to you. But so
Well,
this
that's
is
fine.
this is a theory. Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight, and then later Dr. Alan Mills in 1995 proposed this theory for how the images came about. And it's a combination type theory. So it involves direct contact or semi direct contact, gas diffusion. It also involves Volkringer patterns and the added photographic Russell effect. So the Russell effect, it's an effect named after W.J. Russell, who first discovered unwanted images of primitive photographic plates back in 1897. So he discovered this in 1897. And Mills says that certain oils and sweat secreted from Jesus as a tortured man's skin, acting in conjunction with the blood and bacteria present on such a person, would release gases such as singlet-oxygen and hydrogen peroxide, which would combine to produce this Russell effect through Volkringer patterns to create the shroud images. So it's a bit complicated, but I'm just going to read a quote. Here's how Alan Mills describes it in his own words. He says, "It has been shown that some species of bacteria," and maybe I should share my screen just so you guys can read it along with me. Okay, entire screen. Hopefully that's showing up and all. So this is Alan Mills' direct quote. "It has been shown that some species of bacteria can evolve traces of hydrogen peroxide, and when coupled with singlet oxygen molecules, can give rise to a Russell effect image. These species of catalase deficient organisms include members of the normal skin biota. It is therefore suggested that the evolution of traces of hydrogen peroxide from enhanced numbers of bacteria flourishing on the skin and hair of the man in the shroud initiated a latent image on the contact side of the linen cloth draped over the supine body. The yellowing reaction due to autocatalytic oxidation by atmospheric oxygen developed his latent image over a period measured in decades. Thus, the shroud images are the direct result of two phenomena. And sorry,
Yeah, sorry, I was just coughing. Carry
oh,
on.
which suggests that the images initiated by hydrogen peroxide, okay, evolved from bacteria coating the body and then developed over decades by the autocatalytic yellowing reaction of cellulose. So that's what the theory is. So yeah, Hugh, I'll turn it over to you. You want me to keep sharing my screen, or can I take that off? But I'm going to turn it to you to say what is this method and what do you make of it?
I the thing is, it's the chemistry of it is so convoluted that I'm afraid I think it's a sort of desperate mixture of trying to get things to work. As you can see, we want a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the other, and with any luck, something will happen. Um, I think the most important thing is these magic singlet oxygen molecules. Now, a singlet oxygen molecule is not a happy molecule, and it lasts for tiny fractions of a second, and it's generated from, I've got a feeling, from within the body. And I don't think there's any way that you can just, as it were, transfer packets of singlet oxygen across any distance at all. I think that's just wishful thinking. Now, it looks as though he's hoping that somehow the hydrogen peroxide will carry singlet molecules around, and then, I mean, I can quite see that they're extremely reactive, and if you could somehow put singlet oxygen molecules against the cellulose, it would react. But I don't think it doesn't add anything to what Adler and Heller said anyway. That the cellulose, I mean, right at the bottom, the critical point is that there is an autocatalytic response, and the cellulose just goes yellow, and it does that in air or it does that with light. And I don't find the singlet oxygen very compelling, and I can't remember where I've
There
had a look
is
at it.
There is something else I've written under plausibility. It says this theory hypothesizes that the singlet oxygen molecules are released as a pure gas, a single state molecule, as opposed to a vapor, which has two phases, gas and liquid states, combined. And that as a gas, it could diffuse in a strictly vertical direction. Okay, so that's vertical mapping. Everything we know. Okay, so yeah, never mind. We'll
But
come to that.
why? I mean, see, does he explain how it diffuses in a particularly vertical direction?
He doesn't. No.
No, I mean, it could diffuse, he says. Well, it could, but how could it diffuse in a strictly vertical direction? Now, the various possibilities have been suggested, one of which is a very severe temperature gradient, and the well-known fact that hot air rises, so that if the temperature of the body was much hotter than the surrounding area, but I don't see it happening because you've got the shroud enveloping it to within a very small amount, and before very long, it would just spread out everywhere. I'm not fond of vertically. Well, I'm not. I don't think much of vertically collimated radiation, to be honest. But at least you can say there may be a mechanism that does that. And in fact, to be fair, the only one that even begins to explain it is Giulio's coronal discharge hypothesis.
Yeah.
But although Vignon got some reasonably good smudgy patterns from his vaporograph idea, I think in general it's just going to produce a blur that's too blurred to recognize the face at any rate.
All right, awesome. So yeah, let's go over the MRFs then. Again,
Yeah, yeah,
so negativity, I assigned a question mark for that. But what's your take? Would it give us a photo negative or a quasi negative image?
um, let us suppose that it could rise in a vertical direction. Then yes, I mean we're dealing with single, and that it existed at all, but we're dealing with single oxygen atoms banging into the into the cellulose. So they would very definitely go produce, presumably according to the body cloth distance relationship, would work very well. In that sense, they would produce the negativity in the 3D version that we're used to, and also the extreme superficiality. It certainly wouldn't go very far. I mean,
Okay.
I'm saying that the atoms wouldn't actually reach the cloth at all. But if they did reach the cloth, they wouldn't burrow into it. They'd react with the surface and stop.
Okay. But there's question that it would even make it to the cloth. You're saying it
I don't
would.
think they'd make it to the cloth at all. No.
Gotcha. Okay, so yeah, there would just be no images, so let alone highly resolved images and stuff like that. And with the 3D and the negativity, you said that's only if a scientific impossibility is true that somehow the gases were vertical or something like that,
Yeah,
which they
but I
could.
mean, I think um, that we mustn't dismiss that because all the radiation hypotheses work the same way.
But
I
those
mean, they.
but those are supernatural, right? So if you want to
Oh,
do
I
a
see. Yes,
supernatural,
as a natural hypothesis, I think the singlet oxygen is the absolute non-starter.
yeah,
But if you were to throw in a bit of miracle with it,
sure.
then possibly that would be one way of doing it.
Cool. Yeah. For me, I could care less. I don't distinguish between supernatural mechanisms.
No,
It's
no.
Bob.
But I mean, obviously, God could be a supernatural physicist, and if you're an atomic engineer, that's what you assume. But he could also be a supernatural chemist, and if you're a chemist, perhaps you'd rather go down that way.
There you go. Yeah. That from my perspective, the more the merrier on that front. I'm
Okay. Yeah.
specifically assessing these as Shroud skeptical theories, which denies the supernatural. They're saying it's either an artistic mechanism or it's natural. But so yeah, it's
I,
total
I
fail.
gather they were hoping to call this natural, but I don't think it would work in a natural point of view at all.
The other thing is there is no sign of decomposition or putrefaction. These mechanisms posit lengths of time, right? to, I think, on the order of decades and stuff like that. So
Oh, well, no, the image is on the order of decades. You see, once the autocatalytic bit means that once you've started the reaction, it feeds itself. So it just carries on all the way along the line, regardless of external circumstances.
okay,
So,
might be
for
why.
example, yeah, if you an 18th century way of blowing up ships, would you believe? But it'll illustrate the point. Was to creep with somebody swimming and attach a barrel of gunpowder to the bottom of the ship underwater with a long hose pipe going to a rowing boat about 20 meters away.
Hmm.
And then what you did was you set, and the hose pipe was full of gunpowder.
Mhm.
So you set fire to the gunpowder and then you plugged the end and then you rowed away as fast as you can. And the gunpowder carried on reacting along the hose pipe
I see.
underneath water. It didn't require any other input
Yeah, that
because its own heat and its own heat released oxygen from the saltpeter and kept the reaction going. And then the idea was it would then reach the barrel attached to the ship, blow the whole thing up, the ship would sink, while the little guy who'd set it was rowing frantically away on his rowing boat. So that's
that
what I mean by catalytic. Having started the reaction, you could then clear the body out, resurrect it, clear everything away, and the image would carry on slowly forming itself.
Yeah, that must be why I even gave it two green check marks. So that must be why when I was originally studying it. So okay,
Ah.
yeah. So I think we've kind of covered it. Anything else besides the singlet oxygen theory just sucks. It's a non-starter. Obviously, once again, you as a Shroud skeptic and I at the pro Shroud, we are on the same side. We
Yeah,
this is
I
nonsense.
don't think we would go for that in a big way. No.
Okay, all right. So with that said, there is a theory that's not covered. This is the last one for today.
Yeah.
Um, well, actually, let me just ask you out of curiosity, for future panel shows and stuff, other than the artistic Volkringer pattern, which you've kind of discovered here, in our Shroud panel shows, have we covered every single artistic and natural theory that you know of? Are there any ones that I've missed that we should cover in a future show?
I can't think of any offhand that somebody else has come up with. Um, we've done you've done the Nicholas Allen
Yeah,
light photograph one, and you've done the other one,
the
the
shadow
Wilson the
grenade.
Wilson, the Wilson light one.
There was one that I skipped that was under that category, but it was similar. It's the Solar Sergio Sergio Monderev or something like that. But I again that was kind of refuted for the same. If you want me to share,
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. No, to be honest, I think it,
awesome,
I
awesome. Well,
haven't.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to be. This is what I want with this to be a record. So
Yeah, you've been so thorough.
we have covered every ordinary artistic, every ordinary naturalistic explanation. And I think we've shown them all wanting, with possible exceptions on Hugh's hypothesis, which we'll get an update on from Giulio Fonte, in March sometime from Giulio and Hugh. And also now this artistic Volkringer method, which Hugh is going to do some experiments and maybe we can.
Oh, well, I've
Oh,
got to find Volkringer's book first, and which, as I say, he published a book on it, but it was about the shroud.
fair
But
enough.
I
So,
didn't.
so yeah, those are the two outstanding. But we also have the supernatural theories, and we did look at the various radiation ones. I'm hoping to bring Giulio on at some point to talk about the divine photography proper hypothesis, because I haven't done a show on that. But there is another supernatural theory that apparently a fan of the show, Annette, told me about by a guy named Thomas Devins,
Oh, yes, yes, yes,
the
yes.
rainbow body
Hmm?
hypothesis. And so I'll just play a clip because I never heard of this theory when I wrote my 300-page book on the shroud or chapter on the shroud. But I will include an assessment now. So okay, sharing my screen and um, So what is the basically Shroud skeptics will say, well, there's another supernatural theory that fits Buddhism. Instead of saying Jesus rose from the dead and some kind of electrostatic or supernatural radiation theory caused it, maybe the images were caused when Jesus turned into a rainbow body, as Tibetan Buddhism teaches. So, first of all, I just want to play what is a rainbow body? Here's the guy who supposes it. This is Thomas Devins, and I'll just play a couple minute clip of him explaining his thoughts here.
And it's indicative of a radiation release. Researchers would have known this had they done their homework. That is, had they conducted a front-end survey, a literary search, to determine if the historical record contains instances of human bodies vanishing from sight in a shower of radiation. Not only would the researchers have found evidence that it happens, but they also would have found that the mind plays a central role in making it happen. The phenomenon they missed is known as rainbow body, and it occurs in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and has been since the beginning of the Christian era.
Okay, so that's a clip from Thomas Devins explaining. So you can see he's linking rainbow bodies with radiation, and we've covered radiation theories before, so I'm not so much interested in that, but it's this theological aspect of the rainbow body. And here's a clip explaining the doctrine of the rainbow body from the Buddhists. So it's a 3-minute clip. That's where the rainbow light comes from, multicolored. So that's what I wanted to show. Basically, it says that the body of Jesus, supposing it was Jesus, according to Thomas Devins, he achieved enlightenment like the Buddha. So his body over 7 days shrank, leaving behind nails and hair as the only impure elements, right? But the rest of his body shrank until it shriveled up and dispersed in multicolored light, which takes the form of rainbows. Hence the name, Jesus got a rainbow body. And somehow this released radiation in the process and created the shroud images. Now, before I get into my own assessment, Hugh, I want to turn it over to you. This is a very interesting supernatural alternative. What do you make of the rainbow bodies there?
Well, it's a lovely idea, but I don't think anything of it at all, as you can imagine. Part of the reason is if you begin with the kind of announcement again, it's overconfidence. Announcement of what the science is that Tom does in his series of lectures. I listened to them the other day. He published quite a lot. They were quite small. He called himself Shroud University, possibly not knowing that Russ Briot has got a Shroud University website as well. And he published a little book called Christianity's Dirty Little Secret, which rather implied that the hierarchy, whoever these spooky people are, know all about the rainbow body and have been know that Jesus was taken up in a shower of rainbows, but have been hiding it from us. So, one is naturally inimical to this sort of thing, but and then you've got to start. The Tibetans believe that the earth consists of 5 elements. Well, I dare say they do, but they're wrong. It doesn't, and you can't just go on making up science. And throughout his whole series of lectures, Tom Devins is very keen to say it's perfectly natural. It's perfectly natural. It's been going on for thousands of years, or hundreds of years at least. There's even a school in Tibet that teaches you how to do it. Well, all this is nonsense. There's only, as far as I can find, 2 descriptions of people actually doing this. One is Mileropa, I think, in about 1500 or something like that. And the other one is a chap who died quite recently, in about 1970 or something like that. And they took quite a lot of pictures, no videos, unfortunately. But he was a very holy man. And as he died, they covered him with a cloak. And when they came back, they found that he'd got much, 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 much smaller, and then eventually completely disappeared. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, I think it's all very sweet, but I don't accept that there is any evidence for it at all, other than some Tibetan monks saying that it was true. Now, Tibetan monks telling American researchers what happened is much different from Tibetan monks telling other Tibetan monks what happened. The one person who took the whole thing very seriously, and who I have a great deal of respect for, was a monk called Father Francis Tiso, I think, who's recently died. And he was very interested in the connection between Buddhist philosophy and Christian philosophy, and how the 2 religions could be closely united, rather in the way as somebody else whose name escapes me. There was another Jesuit who was really keen on the synthesis.
I was going to say, biblical. It's become famous in my Bible study on the historical evidence for the resurrection. Famous biblical scholar Dale Allison has been writing about this, and it's kind of.
Oh yes, he's one. No, there was one much earlier. Another Thomas, I think. Anyway, doesn't matter. But I mean, so people have been very interested in the relationship between Christianity and Buddhism, and our good friends, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, they think that when Jesus, who survived the tomb, walked to India and influenced the religion of Buddhism and made it much more compassionate and much more considerate towards the poor than it ever was before. So from their point of view, Buddhism was actually influenced by Christianity, or by Jesus personally, rather than Christianity as a thing. Anyway, so there is a connection between the two. However, the sort of mystic Buddhism that happens in Tibet, Bon Buddhism, and things like that, is much more a kind of dialogue between Buddhism and Hinduism in a way, with multitudinous gods rather than no god at all, or at least a more amorphous god. And I mean, so I think it's Father Francis Tiso went across to try and find out more about him, and he discovered all about this chap who'd recently died. He died before Father Francis got there, and he came back and he wrote a book saying basically about the connections between the two, but investigating and saying how this phenomenon should be investigated. and how he wanted to go back and study other documents and the cloak in which this Buddhist Lama had been wrapped and all the rest of it, in order to find out whether there was anything in it. But as far as I know, he never went back, and he certainly never published anything in which he discovered more about it. So I think just because he was interested in the phenomenon is not evidence that it actually happened. And I just don't believe that thousands of people regularly in Tibet disappear. Well, they probably do, in the way that thousands of people in Middle America or Venezuela regularly disappear. But they don't just disappear in little clouds of dust without anybody saying something about it. So I'm afraid I don't give it much credence. And also, of course, it's got nothing to do with the shroud, whatever. Jesus, as far as we know, did not. I mean, nobody noticed rainbows and things at the time of the resurrection. There's no evidence on the shroud that he got slowly smaller and smaller and smaller. He didn't take weeks and weeks for this to happen, and so on. No, there is no real comparison at all, in my opinion. Tom's quite a keen reader of blogs, so he may reply underneath saying how wrong I am.
Yeah, and I will, for the audience, I reached out to Thomas and invited him to be on this panel, but I didn't hear anything back from him. So he had an opportunity, and yeah, he's free to leave in the comments if that's what he prefers. But I did my due diligence to bring on all sides. He was invited on this panel.
Yeah.
But yeah, my take is, yeah, I pretty much agree with everything Hugh was saying. Look, as Christians, Buddhism is nonsense. It is a false religion and can lead to damnation. So it's very serious. We shouldn't be mixing up bodily physical resurrection that the Bible teaches as being responsible, for Jesus's resurrection, and creating the images on the shroud with Buddhist doctrine and teaching that is just false about the world. So obviously I have strong theological convictions, but as terms of an objective assessment, historically, there's no mention of rainbow bodies. Look, the practice goes back to this Bon, right? In Tibetan Buddhism, it's spawned from the Bon, indigenous Bon religion. And these, at best, rainbow bodies aren't mentioned until the 7th or 9th centuries AD. So there is no, I did the literature review. Maybe I missed something, but I didn't find any mention of rainbow bodies going back to the time of Jesus. The earliest is 7th to 9th centuries AD, 700 years after Jesus, or 600 years after Jesus. Additionally, let me just share my screen. All right, so here's my Bible study slides that I did when I was studying the historical evidence, right? Additionally, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. As Hugh mentioned, nobody saw a rainbow body or anything like that, a rainbow light. And it also takes 7 days. There are inconsistencies. It's 7 days for the body to shrivel up and then immerse as rainbow light out of the tomb. Well, we know the body was in, Jesus' body rose on the 3rd day. I think Teddy Pappas has calculated it's about 36 hours that the body was in the tomb. And then he rose from the dead. He left the shroud, leaving behind the miraculous images. That's totally inconsistent with the 7 days needed to get a rainbow body, during which time we would have signs of, decomposition liquids accumulating on the shroud. Well, that's not, Sturps discovered there is no decomposition liquids in sufficient quantity to represent, that kind of decomposition over 7 days versus within 3 days. Secondly, rainbow bodies leave behind the impure elements, the hair and the nails. That wasn't found in the Shroud of Turin. Thirdly, the body shrinks, right? Here's a picture of one of these alleged monks getting a rainbow body with a body the size of a baby. They're in the midst of shrinking up and shriveling up and turning into rainbow light in their enlightenment state. Well, if that happened to Jesus, when exactly did the radiation event take place? If it was on the 7th day, wouldn't we have little baby Jesus images on the shroud or something like that, or like a little size of an ant or something like that? Instead we have his full 6 feet or 5 feet, 11 inches, whatever it is, images of Jesus. And the radiation event of the rainbow body didn't take place right away, right? So that's an inconsistency. Also, this is kind of an issue with the Gospels, but remember, the shroud was folded neatly to the side. But under a rainbow body, his body just shrivels up and uh, goes out as rainbow light. So how did the shroud get folded neatly and put to the side? There's just so many inconsistencies here. You can't reconcile a supernatural resurrection radiation event as no, it's not a radiation resurrection. It's actually a resurrection rainbow body. That they just can't be put together in that way. The last thing I want to say on rainbow bodies is that there's zero evidence. The evidence is horrible. There's a little bit more that Dale Allison outlines several lines of evidence for rainbow bodies, and my gosh, they suck. So it's more than just the two that Hugh mentions, but I'm just going to play Dr. Lydia McGrew. She has read all the literature from Dale Allison as well as from the actual Buddhist experts on the evidence. So in the first place, they're esoteric. They won't share the evidence with outsiders. The only way we get it is through leaks, like through the Dalai Lama or something like that. But the evidence is very horrible. So I'm going to play a couple clips of Lydia McGrew explaining what is the evidence that there is a rainbow body phenomenon. Okay, so that's until 35:45. Okay.
They're not comparable. They're not similar. That's the question, is whether they're comparable or similar. So let me talk a little bit about how they're not comparable or similar. How difficult in some of the things that he quotes and cites as evidence would it be to be mistaken? And for some of the people whose accounts we have, to just be mistaken. Now, it might be that somebody else is carrying out a fraud, but in that case, we don't know who they are or whether anybody knew who they were and whether they got in any trouble for it or whatever. And for many rainbow body claims, and for many of the people, not that hard. He has this very strange quotation concerning the Dalai Lama, who believes that someone achieved rainbow body. He is the Dalai Lama. He furthermore knows firsthand some of the witnesses involved, witnesses who handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. You want to know what the physical evidence is? A piece of a robe. Okay, so the Dalai Lama talked to a couple disciples of one of the Buddhists who supposedly achieved rainbow body. They appear not to have gotten into trouble for doing this, and they meet the Dalai Lama and they say, yeah, our master achieved rainbow body, and they hand him a piece of cloth. This is a joke. This is like a bad epistemological joke. If I said that my husband flew around the house yesterday and I handed you a shoe and I said, and this was the shoe he was wearing, that shoe proves nothing. That's not physical evidence related to the event. What are you talking about? It's a piece of cloth. It could be from somebody's robe. It could even be from that master's robe. That is no evidential vector at all to support their claim beyond the claim itself. Ridiculous. They handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. I mean, if the Dalai Lama thought, wow, ooh, you handed me a piece of his robe, then, Allison has this other talk about how the Dalai Lama is incredulous. Well, if he thought the piece of the robe was epistemologically relevant, that's pretty darn credulous. All right. Or there was one case where they were coming in every day after the person died, and there was this robe covering his body completely to begin with. And then people would come in, and they believed that it looked like the object under the robe, which was presumed, Allison says, to be the body, was getting smaller each day. Now, the object's under the robe. We don't know what they're presuming to be the body. This reminds me of the origins of Mormonism, where Joseph Smith wouldn't let the other so-called witnesses even see the alleged golden plates. He said he'd been told he'd be killed if he showed them, so he had these metal plates of some kind wrapped up in his tunic. And they said they saw them with the eyes of the spirit. So it's like, object under a robe. Okay. Or to come in and say that the body was gone later. So they would open the room after 7 days and the body was gone. Okay, so maybe the body was gone, but to be mistaken about whether it turned into a rainbow, that's very easy.
All right, and there's another bit here, 4-minute clip starting at the 41 and 52. Okay, so this is the last little 4-minute clip, and then I'll come back to you, Hugh.
Authorities, but there are also people out there who are saying, yes, so-and-so achieved rainbow body, and apparently nothing is happening to them whatsoever. Or, we came in and we found the body missing, and nothing's happening to them. Moreover, finding the body missing is not, it's just like one small bit of evidence. A body can be missing for a lot of reasons. In the case of the disciples, I contend that what we have is that these people are saying, we were with him, we met with him, we ate with him, we were able to touch him after he rose from the dead, after he had been dead, and then he met with us in a group. That's not the kind of thing you can be mistaken about. As Tim likes to say, it's like, did you spend spring break with your best friend and a group of you all together, okay, who knew him well? Those same people were making claims they couldn't have been mistaken about in a context where they knew that they were risking death, and some of them suffered death. James, the son of Zebedee, for example, being put to the sword and so forth. And they watched as, that happened, and then the other apostles, even under threat, continued attesting. I'm not saying Stephen was an original witness, but he was stoned, so there was a very real context of danger. And then, of course, we do have, I think, some fairly solid attestations of some other disciples suffering death, but right in Acts, it's clear that they are risking death. And they would know if what they are saying is false, and what they are saying is enormously strong support for Jesus' resurrection. Now, this is where I would refer you to other work where you're saying, but it's embellished. Okay, I have arguments about whether the gospel authors embellished their stories and how close those gospels were to the facts, and I am going to refer you to another book, but I'm presenting a case that, if its premises hold up, is a very strong case. And that's why I think I should intrigue you, if you still have doubts about embellishment, to look into that further.
Okay, so yeah, I think that kind of covers the point there. Look, when it comes to the resurrection appearance claims, we have credible evidence there from witnesses who were in a position to know whether or not what they were claiming was true or not. And it was in a context where they were being persecuted. We know they were sincere in those claims, and those resurrection claims are contradictory with the Buddhist claims. The evidence for the rainbow bodies, on the other end, is nothing. A robe, or we have somebody coming into a room 7 days later and the body's missing. Okay, well, it could be missing for any number of reasons. It doesn't prove it turned into a light. And with the testimony we have from the Buddhist monks, they've got a bias to lie, and they're not in a context where they're being persecuted for this. So we can't rule out fraud on their part. So the resurrection versus rainbow body evidences, it's night and day, I would argue. And there's also inconsistencies with the doctrine of rainbow bodies versus the evidence we have with the shroud. But I'll shut up. And Hugh, you were about to say something, so over to you.
No, I just wanted to be slightly more respectful towards the Buddhist monks, because they're working on a completely different plane of interpretation, a plane of consciousness to what we are. Difficult to describe it exactly, but they're not amongst themselves. They're thinking of the rainbow body, I suspect, much more as a spiritual construct rather than something that anybody actually saw. You see what I mean? And in some ways, they're related a little bit to the people who think that the resurrection was an entirely spiritual thing. Now, you and I and lots of other people. Oh, I've frozen. You've frozen. Have I
No,
frozen?
no, you're
I
still.
haven't frozen. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Perhaps you were just still.
I was
Um,
just listening. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think of Christianity as being a very rational religion, and it's very much based on exactly what happened. But I don't think. Well, I don't think the Bon Buddhism, which is closely related to the Bon religion of early Tibet, is like that. I think they don't see concrete reality as being particularly important.
So,
And that's why,
okay.
sorry,
So if that's true, then why are they providing Western evidence? Why are they taking photos of shrunken
because,
bodies?
because someone's demanding it. And they must know at the time, and I'm absolutely certain the Dalai Lama, he's no fool. And he works exactly the same way as perhaps we might say the leader of the Christian church. You don't make wild statements going, this is happening or this isn't happening. You say that you listen attentively to everybody and you understand their point of view, something like that. And I may say that both the rope and the robe. Now Francis Tyso, who was the person who was shown this robe. He wanted to go back and study it to see if there was anything on it. I mean, as a rationalist, he thought, well, if I could borrow it and bring it back home, we could find out if there's anything on it that would help to substantiate in sheer material terms whether any of this happened or not, or whether it's entirely a spiritual revelation and had no basis in truth whatever. So, I mean, I think an understanding of the way Buddhists work, whether or not you think that their theology is damned or not, most of the Tibetan Buddhist monks that I've met are thinking about things on a completely unmaterial plane, and what actually happens isn't terribly important compared to what ought to happen, or what might happen, or what best substantiates their ideas. If you see what I mean.
I do. So yeah. So I guess on the respect thing. So I will say this. I think all human beings are made in the image of God, and we need to respect in the sense of having the classical principle of tolerance for other beliefs and stuff like that. And so I don't want to be coming across as though I'm mocking or treating the material in a non-substantive way. But that said, I do think that there are criticisms that should be leveled, and
Well, yeah,
they,
yeah. Oh, and this from a factual point of view, you're absolutely right. But bear in mind that I think the only person who was shown these bits and pieces was was a man who was immediately suspicious of them, and he understood as much as Miss McGrew there that a shoe doesn't prove anything any more than a rope or a piece of cloth. It only proves something if you take it back, and supposing, I don't know, they found a lot of dust on it, which turned out to be human skin cells or something like that.
so
Now, as far as you see, we might be thinking, oh, this is absolutely absurd. But I'm thinking of something like the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano,
Mhm.
which I'm absolutely certain somebody took out some bread, if there ever was some bread, and stuck in a bit of heart. There's plenty of faking around, and I'm certain it's a fake.
Mhm.
But there are lots of people who wish it wasn't a fake. But I mean, just think about what your average, what would your average Buddhist monk say coming across that compared to what your average Christian monk would say coming across a cloth which may have wrapped a disappearing abbot's body.
Well,
You know,
see,
I think there's going to be a disconnect on both sides. It's not as if they're both people are attempting to discover the same kind of truth.
well, okay, so I think we've got to be consistent. In terms of hurting feelings, or I don't think it's disrespectful to raise the possibility of fraud. In fact, I'm having Kelly Kearse come on my show next week to discuss the skeptical case with another skeptic on Eucharistic miracles. By the same token, I've had Massimo Paris and Dr. Franco Serafini who are going to come on my show and present the positive case. Now, I think that it's fair to raise fraud. Massimo doesn't like that, but no, that fraud needs to. Why shouldn't it be fraud? And it's the same with the Buddhists. So if you're saying with the Buddhists, they are committing fraud and they don't care about the evidence. They don't think it's relevant, but because they're on a higher level, but they know, well, in order to convince a Westerner, we need to present photographs as though this is proof, or a shoe or a robe or something like that. And
Yeah,
that is
but in a sense,
fraud.
it's not because they don't need the photographs.
Yeah.
It's the none of that evidence is for them. It's because it's being demanded of them, as if somehow I demanded of you. You know, I want to know. I want you to show me some Christianity, and you produced a crucifix,
Well,
and what else have you got? You know,
you did a blog about me, scathing me, entitled "Making Things Up." Now, obviously, I wasn't doing that on purpose, but if I did what the Buddhists did and I said, "Oh, you demand evidence from me about the shroud," and I literally knew something wasn't true, and I made up evidence, that's fraud. That's what you're saying the Buddhists are doing, because somebody said, I need evidence for this rainbow body. Okay, I'll make it up. I'll do this little photo and I'll give them a
yeah,
robe.
but
That's immoral.
we're talking to each other in the same um, uh, civilization context, as it were. We're both Anglophile, Western European American. We're in the same kind of situation. The monks of Tibet, a lot of them have never been out of their monastery.
Mhm.
You know, the concept of the world means absolutely nothing to them, and so they meet foreigners on a. I mean, some of them don't. I've met plenty of monks who are extremely spend a lot of their time in Paris and New York and so on, but some of them, and I suspect that these people who believe in the rainbow body are like that. They live on just a completely different plane. It doesn't. We're not making a contact. So they're
Yeah.
not attempting. They're providing people with what they demand,
But
and they know perfectly well there's no evidence for the rainbow body.
yeah, but
But if
they're
someone says,
familiar. They're all made in the image of God, and even
yeah,
in Buddhist writings, they're familiar with the concept of truth versus
yeah,
falsity and stuff. So again, I'm not. I don't care about blaming them immorally or something like that. I'm just saying there is no evidence for the
oh
rainbow
yeah,
body.
no, I think. I mean, if you say what they're saying is something which isn't true, then I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah,
But I don't think that they're necessarily setting out to. They're certainly not. They're not out to make money out of people who plunge their way deep into darkest Tibet or anything like that.
okay.
Um, you know,
Just
it's not a fraud in that sense. It's a fraud in the sense that they're telling you something which isn't true, but in a sense they're telling you something that isn't true because not you personally, but I mean, you know, people who go there
yeah.
because they want evidence of something that isn't true. You see what I mean?
Yeah, they're trying to
It's as
supply
if
them.
it's as if
But
a 5-year-old child demanded evidence of the tooth fairy, and their mother put a couple of feathers underneath the pillow, together with whatever money that
hmm,
you know, and when they're 11, the child goes, "Listen, you cheated on me. You said there was a tooth fairy, and I believed in it because you put feathers under my pillow."
hmm.
And the mother would go, "No, I didn't want to put the feathers there, but it was you who demanded evidence, and you didn't want to disbelieve. You desperately wanted to believe, and so I gave you what you wanted. I knew it was they were just pigeon feathers." And try and think of it in terms of that kind of clash of intellectual ideas.
Fair enough. I understand what you're saying. If you're saying that's
Yeah.
how they're seeing it, it's kind of like they're a mom just
Right. So the 11-year-old assaults the mother, goes up to the mother and says, "Listen, you lied to me. You
Mhm.
lied to me, and you put something under my pillow, which was a fraud, and you knew it was a fraud. Why didn't you tell me the truth?"
Yeah.
And the
I,
mother would
I would
say, "You didn't
still
want to know the truth."
I still so I take your point. I still disagree with it, and I don't think that
Yeah,
works.
well,
But
yeah, but
that's beside the point, right? But just out of curiosity, while we are on this, I am curious about the issue of damnation. So are you a religious pluralist. Do you think that Buddhists can be saved through following their religion, through following the Eightfold Path, or become achieving a rainbow body, or is it only through salvation in Jesus? Like, what? I'm just kind of curious where you stand on
No.
salvation.
From that point of view, I would say I was definitely a pluralist.
Okay,
I don't believe that only Christians go to heaven.
gotcha. Oh, well, so I'm an inclusivist. So I think there are some non-Christian. Abraham was a non-Christian. He's in heaven. Moses was all the Old Testament guys were non-Christians. But pluralism says that you can be saved not just through Jesus, as the Bible says, through his atoning death and resurrection on the cross for our sins, but through another path, through following another religion. That saves you through being the best Tibetan Buddhist. That method saves you as well. That's what a pluralist says. So are you an inclusivist or a pluralist?
Well, yeah. I mean, perhaps I would say, first of all, I'd like to define. I mean, if one could ask him what Jesus thought Christianity was. And I don't believe that Jesus would consider himself personally believing in my resurrection is terribly important. It's much more important that you love your neighbor as yourself. Specifically, I mean, obviously, from our point of view, the thing that holds our society together and enables us to carry out the teachings of Jesus are the fact of Jesus himself. But I think that Jesus, when he said, no one can come to the Father except through me, I think he was talking to the people who were listening to him. When he actually said, go and do something, what you should do is feed the hungry, address the naked, visit the prisoners, and that sort of thing. And I think it was his, if a Muslim or a Hindu or a Bon Buddhist or a Taoist feeds the hungry, clothes the naked, visit and is humble and compassionate and that sort of thing, I think I think of Barry. I think they're being much more Christian than a lot of Christians who say, I believe in the resurrection, and I'm certainly not going to give you any money, even though you're starving to death, because you're a Muslim or you're a Taoist or something like that. That's not very Christian.
Fair enough. Okay, so that makes kind of
Samaritan was a Samaritan, and he was not a Christian. He wasn't even a good Jew, but Jesus was on his side because he behaved in a Christian way.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes sense then, as to your take on a lot of stuff. And again, we're not here to debate theology and stuff.
No.
If you ever
I think
want
one thing that's perhaps quite important. I don't know how globally your travels are, but I've spent quite a lot of my life in India, Nepal, Japan, and that sort of area. So I know a lot of people who are not non-Christians quite well.
Yeah, before he died, I was lucky enough to talk with Houston Smith. I don't know if you know of him, but he knows the Dalai Lama personally. He was like best friends with all of the big Easterners and stuff like that. So yeah, I remember he was kind of a Christian mystic and stuff, and he had similar views to yourself. And I remember him, we were kind of through emails and stuff talking about evidence and stuff. But okay, cool. So that's fine. We have some differences there, and I don't know. Maybe we could do a show in the future where we discuss that theological issue. If you're up for doing something different, no, it's up to you. But anyways, on the shroud,
Stick to my science.
Okay, so getting back to the shroud, then, do you think that I raised some relevant disanalogies that would rule out the rainbow body hypothesis, even just taking what the Tibetan Buddhist doctrines of that?
Oh, yes. No, I don't. I'm absolutely certain there isn't a single Buddhist who thinks that Jesus was resurrected by a rainbow body. I don't think the Dalai Lama thinks that, and I don't think any of the people in any monastery in Tibet thinks that. I think the only person who thinks there's any similarity at all is Tom Devins.
Okay, so with Tom Devins, do you think his theory can it explain the shroud evidence, or is it inconsistent with the shroud?
No, as we've been through it, it's totally inconsistent with shroud evidence.
Yeah, because wouldn't the images that we would get like a little baby Jesus or so, like a shrunken Jesus image, instead of full-length images. That's just
Well, I mean, I'm now playing devil's advocate here,
okay.
but what about those people who think that when the image of Edessa came to Constantinople, there were some people who said, it's a wonderful image which appears like a child in the morning, an adolescent at midday, and an old man in the afternoon. Have you come across that
Um,
before?
yeah, you mentioned it on your show with Jack, I think, and I think
Yeah.
we just
Well, Jack probably knows more about it than me. But I mean, I don't think that describes the shroud at all. I don't even think it describes the image of Edessa at all. But somebody thinks that it does. So, maybe Tom Devins, perhaps
well,
they'd see a bit
okay,
of sympathy.
great. When you show me a little picture of a little baby shroud Jesus in the morning, taken in the morning, then I'll believe that that's actually happening and stuff like that, right? But the shroud,
Well, unfortunately,
or
yes, I would be doing that.
it's yeah, the shroud images are static, right? That's what we observe. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that past claim, there's no evidence for it, but yeah, all right, cool.
Although I tell you what, you might go into Catalano, Stefano de Catalano. Who's the person who thinks that the shroud actually shows Jesus moving? Amongst great piles of his snakeskin belt and his wreath of flowers and all that stuff. He's just one person. Again, he's who's come up with a bonkers idea, probably got a podcast and used it to make money.
Yeah, I've had fans ask me about doing a show on that, and I didn't know too much about it. I just remember I remember being skeptical and stuff like that, and I remember Barry kind of confirming that yeah, there's nothing to this. There's no moving images on this.
His name is Giuseppe Maria Catalano. He calls himself from the Institute of Advanced Studies of Space Representation Sciences, which is basically his house. There is no such institute.
So with him, is it just the feature that he does, or does he have like a unique image forming mechanism to account for the moving image or whatever? Either way, it doesn't matter. I can do a show just on the feature, but I'm just wondering, does he have an image forming theory that's unique?
Stroboscopic photography. So, and you've got different images all the way along, which is why, for example, one hand is particularly long because you see it in one position and then it's making its way along like that. It's absolute nonsense, but if you want to work your way along it, yes, Giuseppe Catalano of Space Representation Sciences.
Okay, all right, yeah, let's put that in for a future show for sure. All right, go ahead and say if you want to, if you know, give your take on it right now if you want. What you know of it and stuff.
Awesome. His one idea, I don't know how he decided that this must be the idea, is that Jesus was lying face downwards on the shroud.
Okay.
No, it was bonkers from beginning to end, quite honestly.
Fair enough. Okay. I know Teddy has said that I don't believe this either, but she says the mouth is depicted in two different positions. One, it's closed, and then the other, it's like
Oh yes, it's horrible. Yes. No, I don't think much of that either. They open the mouth so they can see the teeth, and I don't think much of that either. Or they keep the mouth closed, but then how come you can see the teeth through a closed mouth? You can't. It's just imperfections. We've done all this trying to get people to. If only someone would send me a picture of the X-ray teeth, but nobody ever does.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that. I'm skeptical on that front, although I know Bob is working on saying instead of X-rays, it's an interference pattern or something like that. So
that's good because it means it doesn't actually have to look like anything.
There you go. Fair enough. So yeah, I think that covers everything else.
Pretty well. Yeah.
Do you have
we'll think of something new.
Sounds good. Yeah. Well, like I said, you've been inspired with the Volkringer to try a new artistic.
Well, I'll try and get hold of a book. Well, first of all, his book, and then try and see if anybody else has actually studied these things, and so they know what they are.
Sounds good. And yeah, and also sometime in March, as soon as Hugh gets up his blog and then Julio
I got
gives a
that.
response, I will be doing the next science-based Shroud Wars, explaining that and reading the paper, and Hugh's going over Hugh's blog and the everything on that front. In terms of historicity of the Shroud, Jack is kind of busy, so he said in April he should be back. So yeah, we'll be restarting up the historicity of the Shroud in April with Jack's series. But other than that, yeah, not much on the Shroud. So take care. And next week I will have Dr. Kelly Kearse on with Kevin Nontradikath, and we'll be discussing the Eucharistic miracles from a skeptical perspective. So yeah, take care and have a great day.
Just little throw in that last little bit. I see Kelly's just published a book saying that the AB blood cannot be justified. His latest paper.
Cannot be justified. Yeah, yeah. I think he's had that position for a long time.
Oh yeah, he's now published a paper on it saying we can no longer say that the blood is AB because even although the tests were carried out, they're not sufficiently precise.
Yeah, yep. And I agree with him. I take that take myself. So cool. All right. Well, have a
Okay.
great week, everybody. Thank you, Hugh, for joining me. And Ken, it was great talk. Oh, there's no Ken yet. But yeah, you're welcome on the show anytime, Ken, if you want to come on. So yeah, have a great day and take care.
Okay.